Good morning, everybody. How are you all doing? I'm really excited that Scala I/O is back this year. This is my third one. This is one of my favorite conferences. And the year it was away, I was very sad. So I'm very glad to be back here. This is the T-shirt from the first Scala I/O. Does anybody remember this from 2014? No? Anybody there? So my talk was about how open source software is now in danger. And that is largely to do with how enterprises and open source companies are working together or not. And because I used to work for Lightbend, you might think that this is largely a rant about that company. It is not. It is about just about every single open source company in the world. And so first of all, who here is a contributor to open source? Any open source project? Look at those hands here. That's what I love about this conference. This is a community-focused conference, and thank you. Thank you for the work you do. Every one of us benefits from what you do. And we're users or we're contributors with you. We get to work together, and we all benefit. That's just wonderful. But who gets paid to write open source software? It's not a bad number. It's probably on the order of 33%, something like that. So not a lot of people do. And how many people wish they got paid to write open source software? Just about everybody. Wouldn't it be great? Wait till you have users. But, I joke, but it can be trying sometimes. The key to this is that we have enterprise support. Companies out there that use open source software have to be willing to support open source software. And that comes in many dimensions. That comes from whether or not they're submitting issues, whether or not they're asking questions and talking to people online that other people can benefit from. And they can pay for it somehow, and somehow make it worthwhile for a lot of the people who do this and love it. And the result of this is that we end up with stable releases of software instead of things that someone has to throw together on their weekends or at night or sometime while their baby is crying or their dog needs to be walked. But no, they've got to get something out for you. And they're doing it only because of their love of software. However, it's very hard to sell free software. You might be surprised to hear this. No, it's hard. And a lot of companies out there, as a rule, will say, we do not pay for open source software. We will not. And we also will not be helpful in the community. We will not do that. I won't name any companies. I won't shame anybody. But this kind of behavior is antithetical to the open source communities that we're part of. And then we look at venture capital. How many people here have worked with venture capitalists? Taken venture capital money? Well, there's nothing wrong with venture capitalists. They are business people like anyone else, and they are helpful to us. They help us create the companies that are in support of open source software. And without their investments, many projects wouldn't move forward. They wouldn't have become as powerful and strong as they are today. And that includes Scala. And that includes other languages and other tools that we all love and depend on. It includes Linux, right? But the people who are investing in these projects have different desires from those who want to consume and buy something from the companies that make these products. The customers always say to me all the time, I just want somebody here to make sure that we're doing this the right way. That's services. That's consulting, training, somebody on site, working with your team. But the investors say they want us to be product companies. They want us to be companies that have a product that they can measure revenue and see revenue growing over time, monthly recurring revenue. And that means that open source companies have to come up with a lot of interesting ideas for products. And those products aren't always what our customers want. For example, something, whatever, as a service. You see in the enterprise, the word cloud is huge. Well, okay, if you're an open source company, say you're someone like Bill, Scala test as a service. I don't know. Maybe there's a business model here. I don't know. It doesn't seem like it at first, but maybe there is, right? You come up with things like monitoring. Okay, we'll do monitoring, but then in that case, it may be monitoring as a service because you have to put it in the cloud and collect things using an agent. Production tooling, that's always one of the biggest ones people go for, but it's also one of the ones that sells the least, believe it or not. Companies will always say, if you only had this, then I need that for production. But then you say, okay, that's great. It'll cost you this much money. Oh, no. Support contracts. That sounds great, and it's actually the one way that is closest to services. You're saying, I'm paying you money, and I expect some sort of, help in return when there's an issue with this product or whenever my team is struggling. Commercial licenses. Now we're getting to the really boring stuff, right? Indemnity and warranties. If you're putting something out there that you are OEMing, we say, or you're putting out a product that other people are buying, right? And it has something like an open source project inside of it, what if somebody puts copywritten material in your project, which they are then selling? Well, they're at risk for liability. And minimal services. That's because the VCs say they want you to do no more than 30% of your revenue in services as you grow. And that's not very much of your revenue. As a larger company, think about a company with $1 million in revenue. You can only do $300,000 in revenue as services, in consulting and training. So you are actually being told not to make money. Instead, try and sell products. And it's harder. So what are you going to do? And then you look at these large companies, and they all say, we have a finite budget. Every company has a budget, and we only have so much money that we can give you. Well, they're using a lot of different open source projects. Maybe they're using an open source platform as a service. Maybe they're using an open source language, an open source tool that helps them scale, who knows what. And every single one of those are competing for the same small budget. And meanwhile, if you look at some of the larger banks here in Europe, they may have a contract with an extremely large software, hardware vendor that exceeds $1 billion a year. Just one bank. And meanwhile, open source, you walk in and you go to some large hedge fund or something like that and you say, this hedge fund makes billions. And you say, I want $20,000. They say no. No, $20,000. I'll give you 12. And you say, why? So it can be really painful for people trying to do this work, right? And the impact means that the open source software makers have to focus on these large enterprises. They've got to deliver so much, trying to bring value such that they will buy something from them. And that means they can focus less on the community. And has anybody ever felt this way about an open source project they love? That I don't feel like I'm getting, that they care about me in the community anymore. Has anybody ever felt that way? It's not their fault. They are not incentivized to help you, and as a business to survive, this is the way they have to go. So the feature roadmap is everything that some company wants, right? And the community feels left out. And if you're a smaller open source project, imagine there is one person who is largely responsible for an open source project, even though it's a well-adopted, used project around the world. That one person can't make money off of it. They don't have their own entity, so they get hired by a single company, and they spend all their time working on the features that one company wants, and then they come home at night, and they look at what the community wants and try to do that as well. And that's hard, right? Or some companies actually hire that person full-time. We've seen this with a couple projects. I don't want to name them by name, but a really large networking kind of thing you may have heard of. The main contributor to that now works for a very large consumer electronics company that had a big announcement yesterday. So the time of this person who works on this project is now largely focused entirely on that company. And whatever time they have left, they get to help the community, accept pull requests, right? And that's hard. That's hard on everybody. I think that open source companies must grow another way. And I think that back in the earliest times of open source, when we look at, Red Hat, I think Red Hat is largely considered the most successful open source company ever. And They didn't start out trying to sell products per se. They sold services. They said, hey, let's get people to use our stuff. Let's make them successful. And once we have a large enough customer base, then we can start offering products because we understand our customers instead of the other way around, where we don't understand our customers, but we have to come up with something anyway. So that might be a better way to go. And you know what? It would probably mean we have a lot more money to work from, operating capital as an organization, and we can focus on the community because we're not struggling to make the next barrier. Now we can instead focus on delivering value for our customers. Now, global systems integrators, does everybody know what I'm talking about when I say a global SI? They're really large consulting companies. Those, I don't want to name any names or anything like that, but historically they have not been friendly to open source. And that is not because they're evil or mean or something like that. It's just, it's not a focus for them. They make most of their money by helping a company deploy SAP or some other large packaged software or something like that, right? Because it's a great way to make a lot of money. But whenever it comes to custom work, things like implementing a new application using a completely open source stack, well, that's the sort of thing that's harder to say how long it'll take and how much money it'll take and less guarantees for the customer and more risk. So they don't invest in it. And they don't invest in their people being good at it. So their people aren't as well trained with the technologies. Not very often do you see them speaking at a conference like this, right? And that's unfortunate. And that has to change because these are the people who have the inroads to all of those large companies that open source depends on for long-term survival. So how do we get them to start working with open source in a way that's meaningful? This problem has been going on from the outset of open source. I remember in the earliest days of Linux and stuff like that, there were some very choice words for global SIs from the people who were involved in projects. And I remember in 2007, the head of a really large open source project repeated some of these obscene words in a keynote in front of a whole bunch of people. And everybody went, oh. But you know what? They were frustrated because they weren't getting the help and support they needed. And really, I would tell you, as somebody who has watched the open source community and consulting and training for years, that the boutique firms, the boutique services firms are the ones who deliver the most value. Because those are the people you see here at the conferences. Those are the people you see blogging about these technologies deeply, moving this community forward, right? And they're always the ones that I know I can count on whenever I have a problem for a customer. If I call one of these firms, they almost always help solve it. But can they be absorbed into an open source company at scale? What if an open source company needs more consultants or something like that? They could acquire one of these firms. And that actually is a really great way to grow the services they need in order to be more successful long term. But how many boutique firms want to necessarily be absorbed into that company? They really like being independent. They may not want to be absorbed into these firms. But this is a two-sided relationship. Those boutique firms, they are marrying themselves to these technologies whenever they say we are experts with them, whether they like it or not. Now, Dean Wampler is somebody I worked with when I was at Lightpen, and Dean had an interesting point whenever I showed him these slides and I was talking about it with him. He said that, does this mean that over time, the only open source that will be successful are the ones that are released from large companies? And we see very successful examples of this, like things you see from Netflix or from Twitter, right? Maybe that is the future of open source, that we won't have these companies around them. But then, by the same token, I see some of the companies that have been created from support of these technologies as well. So I don't know. And I don't know who wins if that happens either. What I would rather see is the kind of open community we have now and the ability to be successful as a business at the same time. So let's look at Scala as a language in particular. And this is one of the areas that I think is the biggest win. That's the Scala Center. And I did draw this in a way so that you see Scala in the center. It really is like that. It is the center for Scala. It is the heart of Scala now. This is beautiful. It is utterly magnificent. Look at the dimensions of investment taking place here. We have, on the upper left-hand side, the Swiss flag, the Swiss shield. This is the government of Switzerland investing through a grant to help create the Scala Center. EPFL, academia, involvement and investment, and actually ownership of the language. Lightbend, enterprise support for people who want to use it. The community, building the ecosystem and the tools that are so important to the success of the language. And then corporate sponsorship, where you see the companies that are investing in the Scala Center, having a seat at the table and talking with the community to decide the future of the language. This is unheard of. And it also is the most powerful aspect of Scala today, if you ask me. I would argue that winter is coming for Scala. I would say that there is going to be a war in the future between companies vying to control it at the same level that Java is being controlled by Oracle. And how good is that for the community? Is it good for the community at all? Scala Center is the insurance that the community will never be left behind. It will control the future of Scala in a way that Java could never be done. And why is that? Well, if we look for how we need to support Scala and other open source projects, we have to make sure that they're all being supported in these same kind of ways. They can't just be supported by the community. They can't just be supported by the corporations. Let's look at languages. If we look at just a selection of languages, but you could apply this to any one of the languages you could possibly think of out there. Scala has the support from academia, community, corporate, enterprise, and government. Closure? Only community, enterprise, right? Through the company that was created to support that, and also the Datomic database. Go has community and corporate because Google is behind it and a community ecosystem building around it. But it doesn't have really academic support. Enterprise support? Government? Certainly not. Groovy? It actually lost its corporate support. Now, I believe there is now a new corporate supporting company. I think maybe Red Hat was going to take this over. Does anybody know for sure? I've forgotten, and I couldn't Google it very easily, so I gave up. But, Groovy lost their enterprise support entity whenever Pivotal said we were done, right? And Java has community, corporate, and enterprise. JavaScript has academia, interestingly, community. Then we look at something like Ponylang, where the company that was going to be the enterprise support for Pony went under, 2-3 months ago. And that's a real hindrance to their adoption. I do know of banks here in Europe that are using Ponylang, and that's wonderful. But without that company being there to support them, and their inability to get the inroads to have people support them, now the people working on Pony are merely just hobbyists, people who love it. And that's unfortunate. So only Scala has this level of support across all these dimensions. And look at the open source projects. Look at Bill working on Scala tests. What support does he have here? He has community, obviously. He has some enterprise support, corporate support, I will say, because he's hired to do work for them. But what about when the community needs help? Who helps him pay for the people he needs to scale up to help everybody else consume Scala test? And that's a really tricky question, right? So how do we support the ecosystem? We do not want these projects to go away. They're very important to all of us. Things like Shapeless and Scala test, and there's just so many different projects in Scala's world that are important to all of us. And we want to make sure they get sponsorship and help and the money they need to move forward. And we don't want it to be just consulting money going directly to an individual who works on it, because that's not what they want. They want to focus on helping everybody. But in reality, that's right now pretty much the only way they can get paid for the work they do. And hiring the creators certainly doesn't help everybody else either. It means that one company has a monopoly on their time. So are coalitions the key? Groups like Typelevel. This is an incredibly powerful group doing amazing things to help grow an ecosystem in an empathetic way. And I'm a huge supporter of that. But how do we fund them? How do we get money to the people working on the CATS compiler? How do we get people who are using Miles's project to be paid for their work? And that's a really difficult thing to say. And we don't want this situation where people are competing, again, for the same dollars, because a company only has a finite budget, and they say, well, I'm just going to give it all to just one company. Well, that's unfortunate, because they're relying on all of these projects. So, what if we were to create a site to help in this regard? Wouldn't it be great if there was something like Kickstarter or GoFundMe, where you could say, I want to support Scala Test, and I want to support Shapeless, and I want to support Specs 2. I want to support all of these projects that are really meaningful to me. And then you could check out. But think about it not for you, think about it for an enterprise. And suddenly the problem starts to break down a little bit because of something called vendor management. Has anybody ever heard of this? This is, you want to go in and sell something to a company. They agree, that's something awesome, they want to buy it from you. Now you have to go through procurement. And you have to be an approved vendor. And it's so painful. But you look at these large companies like IBM or Accenture or these extremely large organizations that are working with so many companies around the world. They have those relationships. So how can we bridge such that we can leverage the vendor relationships and also make sure that we get the money we need to make these projects long-term successful? Miles actually pointed me out to something I didn't even know about this called Bounty Source. And this is how Sam Halliday, who's getting quite a lot of pub this morning, and the Ensign Project are raising money to help them make the Ensign Project even better. And this is wonderful. It solves exactly the problem I was thinking about with the lone caveat of vendor management. Because, again, if you're a really large company out there, you don't just sit there and go to bountysource.com and say, all right, here's $5,000. No, let's just give them the credit card. No, that's not what happens, right? They've got to have approved relationships with vendors, and that's the one thing that's missing here. So how do we bridge that? I don't know, and I think it's really important. I want to work with these really large companies that have those vendor relationships and see if we can come to some sort of mutually beneficial agreement. They benefit from our existence as open source. We benefit from them having the relationships we need in order to get the money we need to have successful projects. So, what if we could do that? And that's something I'll be working on going forward. Vendor management, I already talked about this. So, we need to support the ecosystem. We need to make sure that these projects don't disappear because somebody doesn't have time to work on it anymore. This needs to be more than that. They have to be able to, the other projects out there have to be able to bring in all of the people they need to make these projects even more successful. And we must work all together to do so. So that was my talk. Does anybody have any questions? Did I bore everybody? Hi, Miles.
Yeah, that's great stuff. And all of it is extremely familiar to me, and I suspect many others, certainly Bill. So a big question is, well, okay, what's next?
Well, what's next is I'm going to be going to some of these large corporations with the vendor management. Interestingly, I now work on the other side. I now work in the enterprise. I don't know if everybody knows this, but I left and went to Starbucks about 6 weeks ago. And now I have a lot of clout with some of these vendors. And I'm going to be talking with some of the heads of them. And some of the discussions I'm going to be having are around, ways that we can improve, like women in tech, using projects like Scala Bridge. And most of these organizations are very much in favor of supporting these kinds of initiatives. But another way to do this is to talk to them and say, look, yeah, I'd love to have you come work with my company, or I'd love to buy your product, but while you're at it, your vendor management system, is that something that we can pull in for something like Bounty Source? And then I can work with Bounty Source and see if that's valuable for them as well. I have to investigate all this because I just learned about it yesterday. Yeah, but even if it's not possible, right, there's still the possibility that, what if it was a project like Scala Test sponsored by Starbucks. I'm not kidding. What if it were? What if companies like mine were to say that we sponsor this project, not because we want, Bill's consulting hours or something like that, but because we think this is an important project we are dependent on for our future. And
a lot of Scala Test was probably written at Starbucks.
Bill says that a lot of Scala Test was probably written in a Starbucks. So, yeah, I imagine a lot of code has been, yeah. And I might be the only person who doesn't drink coffee working at Starbucks. So, I bet everybody really wanted to talk about open source business models in the morning. Oh, yes.
Yeah, just a quick, I don't know, maybe idea. What do you think about a system like Tipeee? I don't know if you've heard of Tipeee, on YouTube. So basically, if you like a video on YouTube, you have a link where you can basically tip the person that did the video. So maybe say like a similar system where you have a button on GitHub, let's say, you like the project and you could just tip the person a few bucks. And even better if you had like a blockchain behind it so you could get out of the grips of PayPal, basically.
Yeah.
I don't know if that would work.
I think it's a good idea. I'll be the first to admit, I only recently noticed, for example, that Scala Center had individual contributors. 2 of them are here, at least. I know Trond Bjørkestrand and Heiko Sieberger are here. They individually contributed to Scala Center and therefore invested in it, just in a similar way as that. It's possible, but I don't know as developers how many of us would actually do it. And that's not meaning to rip on us, right? But I think there has to be more. And maybe that more is something like, okay, we'll have something like that on GitHub or wherever with corporate matching. Because if you ask me, the corporations have to do their share. Yeah, it's not up to us. And the corporations, like I said, they're not going to whip out their credit cards. They don't do that. So how do we get them involved?
But sometimes it's also the user experience. I think we're not all, like for example, sometimes you see on Wikipedia saying, okay, please help us with, I don't know, $5, whatever.
Yeah.
And if there was a solution, like an easy, just click on a button and then you donate immediately without having to enter your credit card.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe that would help. Maybe it's a user experience problem also.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. What I really don't want to see is open source where you've got to watch an ad before you get to compile. That's coming, You want to run these tests? Watch this video. Bill's suddenly feverishly working away.
In France we have
yes.
In France we have the 1% for art projects related to big planning and big infrastructure. Can't we imagine that for big software project, by law, you have to spend money on open source? It could be. I know it's hard, but
I know. If we make it a legal requirement, then it's like buying insurance to a degree, where they say you have to have insurance, and then some people do, and some people try to fly under the radar. What if they don't have the money to? But they still need to create a project. Maybe they're doing it for a good cause. There's all kinds of edge cases that might make that not viable. I don't know. I don't want to make it so that it's required. If you want to use this open source, what if we put in a license? What if we said, yeah, if you're a free project, you get to use this, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's not exactly that. You don't have to use free software. It's even more like if you build huge software infrastructure, you have to invest in software. The same as if you build a road in France, an autobahn or stuff like that. You have to invest in art, and that's it. I mean, it's like.
So in other words, it'd be a license term, like I was just about to say, right? Where in order to use this, you have to do this. You have to pay this money. I don't know. I could see that, believe it or not, actually helping the large vendors who don't do open source, right? What?
I think the suggestion is something more along the lines state support via taxation, I think. Is that right? Sure.
So the government is doing it by default. I don't know. I don't know if that would fly in the United States. We're very weird that way, right? We say that we don't believe in socialist approaches and stuff like that. And at the same time, we then tell everybody, okay, we're not going to give you free health care, but you must buy it. You know, we're very weird that way. I'm not saying it's good either, but yeah, I don't know. I think that would require a lot of lawyers and government people, and that usually scares me. So I don't know. Yes, up there.
Shouldn't people like Bill accept to become a professional service company with a product called Scala Test, hire a lot of people doing tests on site for their customers, and then keep investing on his own product? I mean, service is not that bad, and product help you differentiate from others. So maybe we should also try to change the venture capitalist mind about it.
Yeah, that's something Bill actually already does with his Escalate. But at the same time, unless he scales Escalate to be more and more people that can pay for him to live while at the same time working on his project and not out doing consulting work, so that he can grow Scala Test bigger without himself, or maybe the other way around. Maybe he's consulting, but he has to pay other people to do the work for building the project out. Either way, it's a question of scale. And I think Bill wants to answer this too.
Hello? Yes. Yeah, we do that. I mean, I did try to do products just because I thought it would be fun. Like that compiler plugin I demoed, there's a product version of it. The one I showed was free. But people just don't want to pay for tools. And I think it's just human nature. Like, I don't pay for Wikipedia. And so I don't blame people for not paying for Scala Test. And I think it's kind of a... the other place I've noticed this was journalism. We don't want to pay for newspapers, but we put up with ads that we hate, and we don't get as good journalism as maybe we would like. But that's sort of what we get. And I think open source is good enough, but it could be better if somehow we could get funding models better.
Yeah.
But you don't actually need, I don't think, consulting makes money, so you don't need venture capital for that. But what I wanted to add to that was like, we do that, and it's actually our team and not Escalate for that, but it's still like, you still have to have a hard time justifying spending time on the open source when you're paying people, because you could be spending time, they could be making a product or a service or something that will make money. So it's still, even if you do have a way of funding your company that's supporting the project, it's still hard to justify just working on the open source one.
And so inevitably, these people who are working on these projects do it out of their own time and money. Yeah. And love, really. They're making you run all around.
Say you have the money, how would you split it among the contributors in an open source
That's
project?
a really good question. Maybe, if the money was given out on an annual basis or something, if you're contributing on a monthly, this money would be amortized across a monthly basis for a year. And the people who give the most contributions, and that you can't do it by line numbers. We all know that's a completely flawed metric. And anybody who tells you that I'm the best contributor because of the lines of code that doesn't make any sense. So no, let's think in terms of, value that they bring to the project. Maybe it's new features, maybe they fixed a big bug, like Miles by fixing SI 2712. Here's a lot of money. You're rich, Miles. No, but I think there would have to be some agreement within a governance of the project, right? Whether or not that's one person who's in charge of it or a committee of people. Like, look at Enzyme. How do they do it? How does Sam do that? He's not the original creator of the project. That was Eamon Cannon or something like that, if I remember his name correctly. He was still also represented there if you look at that page. Everybody deserves something. Maybe it's a royalty for having been the person to create it, right? I don't know.
Hello. What about the idea to create like a trademark or a logo and to say, okay, if it's you can use it on your communication supports and so on. If you pay for that, it could be like a tax or evaluation, but because the company wants to get that on their communication to say, okay, we are supporting the community, so we use this logo, but to get the right to use the logo, you have to trade or to sign a contract with a Scala Center, for example, and then this money will be split between the projects based on the value and so on.
Yeah. I think this gets back into the same kind of issues you see where companies will not use GPL or LGPL, where they say, you know what, that's stuff we will not touch. Just because legal concerns. What if it's something they're distributing because it's a product they themselves are creating? You know, how much do they owe for that? They may just not even want to deal with it and just say, well, then you can't use it. And I've seen that a lot more often than companies say, here's money. Yeah, I don't know. Manuel, did you have a question? If anybody wants a good workout, you can just do the question and answer for this room.
I was wondering, IBM is supporter of the Scala Center, right?
Yes. Yay, IBM, by the way. Yay.
This idea of a trademark or of a, you know, you see it on food, this stamp, high quality food, high quality thing. If this were to start somewhere, it would need to be bootstrapped and supported by large organizations like IBM. Because nobody got fired for choosing IBM, right? So if IBM endorses this thing or this set of tools, and I think it's in their advantage. So I think in order to bootstrap this, it has to start by the top, by the establishment.
Yeah. You know, and I think maybe that'll happen because one of the things IBM is doing is developing their own products with open source software, right? And that's why they're so involved in Scala Center, because this is something they're beginning to rely on more and more. And as they start developing their own product set, they may also come up with their own platform of tools that they endorse and also have their own add-ons to that allow for a development platform sort of, I don't know. It kind of reminds me of the 2000s. Like, you know, way back in the JEE days where you were working in visual whatever. Ooh. But it was like that, right? I could see that happening. But with open source software, it's harder for these companies to control it. Back then, most things were proprietary and owned by a couple of vendors. In these cases, I don't know. It'll be interesting to watch. Anybody else? It's exciting, huh? Good stuff. All right, well, thank you. Oh, is there somebody else? One?
Okay. Yeah, you said you were gonna talk to big companies. So what's the actual plan here? What are you gonna tell them? What are they gonna do? Is it just gonna be like a couple of companies gonna be, oh sure, we can pay some money here and there, but then what about the ecosystem, right? Just gonna be like the companies you're gonna talk to. What about building something bigger or bigger platform or something more,
right.
towards like several companies?
Yeah, right now, my original thought was I was going to build this site, but it turns out there's already one. So there's no sense doing that. Now the question is, can I get the vendor management side to be applied with something like Bouncy, whatever they were? Rats. Anyway. Can I get vendor management applied so that people can actually give money in a meaningful way that can be distributed, right? This kind of annual recurring fee that they may want to, give to these projects, where they can pick the ones they want and give money. I have to figure out how to bridge that vendor management side, and that's the first thing I'm going to do. Yeah.
It's just struck me, there is something I think you left out of the picture, which I think is extremely important, and certainly it's been very, very important for me, it's been very important for Typelevel. And that is that there is kind of a way around the vendor management hurdle. in some contexts, which is the sort of the open source project plant, if you like, sort of a person who is involved in an open source project who works for some big corporation and then acts as an advocate of that particular open source project within the organization.
Yeah.
And that can have an awful lot of quite important and useful consequences. So, for example, that individual can introduce, say, cats, for example, or shapers, or something like that, make it a key important constituent of a piece of production software. That can result in a team needing to be trained. That can lead into resources being sort of channeled in the direction of some of the boutique consultancies that you mentioned, and it can often turn out that those corporations can be persuaded to, for example, sponsor community events and various other kinds of projects and things like that. That certainly has been in my experience as far as the Typelevel stuff is concerned. And maybe we're just lucky and we've managed to do quite well with this. But I think there is definitely a if you like a bottom-up model which operates along those lines, which is I guess complementary to the rather more top-down model that you're sort of angling at here as well.
Right.
I don't see any reason not to try and support both, but I'm not sure the picture's quite as bleak currently as you painted it. I think there is activity going. I mean, I remember we were talking the other night, and I sort of mentioned that kind of getting sponsorship money for the Typelevel summits was actually quite a lot easier than I expected it to be. And I remember you being sort of surprised that this was possible. Yeah. But I mean, I don't think it's unique, and I'm sure there are other kind of situations where that happens. And I think the key thing is the sort of the project advocates within companies, within corporations. And I guess it's a message to everybody here. I mean, if you work for a company and you use particularly important bits of open source software, then I think all of you need to act as advocates for those projects within your organizations and try and, by some means or another, by some route or another, persuade your employers to channel resources back to those companies, those projects, either by giving you some kind of time to work on the project. If you find bugs in those projects, maybe to spend some time working on fixes and then try and get through, if there are any, the legal barriers to you contributing back to the project, and that can often be a problem. Ask your employer to sponsor you to come to a conference like this, for example. I mean, that's always helpful for those projects. Or try and get hold of people to come and train you in various kinds of aspects of that kind of stuff, and that will help.
I don't disagree with you. There's two things about this that I think are slightly worrisome. One, that the bottom-up approach becomes the top-down. That over time, the people who are there from a company who are supporting this project in an ancillary way, they become core. And then the project becomes to be run by this company, much the same way as if that person the person who ran it was hired, right? That can never happen, hopefully. But secondly, with the support of an event or a summit or a training or something like that, those are not the same thing as a contribution to the project, right? They may result in extra money being taken in by the organization that is then a contribution to the project, but in and of itself, it's still an effort to make these things that have costs and time that some organizations and people simply don't have. So, Typelevel is fortunate. As a coalition and a group, they have people who are working together to help create the training materials, help grow the community because of a love of what they're doing, and that's amazing. I love it. At the same time, to get the money to become the force that Typelevel could be, I think, sponsorship from the enterprise in a meaningful way has to happen. Martin, I was wondering if I was making you uncomfortable.
Great talk, Jamie. I wondered whether you're familiar with Bruce Eccles' bounty model for funding open source, what he proposed recently.
I've heard about it, but I haven't looked into it deeply. And the thing about it that I wonder is, what is the impact of the people who are giving the money? What are they getting for it? Is it just donations?
Well, to briefly sum it up, you have an established open source project. The next version would be not open, would be closed. until a bounty is paid. So essentially it gets unlocked by the bounty. So by paying part of the bounty, you get the latest version to use, so the latest stable version. And but on the other hand, there's sort of an implicit contract that open source companies won't get rich on their clients once the bounty, which I assume is reasonable, is paid. The thing is open to use for all. So that's in a nutshell his model. And I wondered whether you had thought about it.
No, I hadn't, and that worries me because it's punitive, right? It's punishing people who may or may not be in a position to benefit from the new features until somebody else can pay for it. And that hurts charitable organizations, and that hurts the small people working on projects and startups that simply don't have the money. It could hinder innovation.
Well, presumably again, I'm just quoting Bruce here, essentially the fees for getting access would be very reasonable and would probably be on the level of a simple donation for a simple user, maybe for a charitable organization. But companies could sort of unlock all of the bounty and then put their name on it and said, look, I paid for you all, the new version is free now. So essentially there's a small minimal, but there's sort of no limit to the amount of money you could pay for it.
Is that what Bounty Source does? No, it doesn't. I didn't think so, but the name, interesting. I mean, so long as it's not hurting people, then I think it's a good idea, but I worry that it sounds punitive, at least. I'd have to look into it. Thanks, Martin.
Kind of just on that directly, I think it's a terrible idea, and the reason I think it's a terrible idea is because for that model to work, it implies that all development has to be done effectively secretly, privately.
What if it's a bug fix?
Yeah, or if it's a bug fix or just ongoing development. It means that nothing can be visible until the bounty has been paid to release the software, and that's just appalling. I mean, I think that completely undermines. It's kind of a look, don't touch.
Yeah, but here's the thing. I also totally get where it's coming from. The frustration of people who are involved in the open source projects, who work so hard and don't get compensated for this. Even people who start these open source companies and are involved with them for years may or may not ever see a dime, right? Seriously.
Jamie?
Is it time?
Yeah, it's a very interesting debate, but it's time actually. It's 25, and the next session is at 30. So.
Okay. Well, thank you.